So firstly, thank you for inviting me to give this talk. It's quite nice. It's something I've wanted to present on for quite a while, and I've deliberately sort of framed it in a slightly controversial way because I think it's nice to have that contrast. There's definitely a version of this I really strongly believe, and a way that this could be read that I don't think is true. So I wanted to clarify what I meant by why good teaching can't be taught. I'll introduce myself in a bit, but I just wanted to talk about the title for a little bit. So on my more contrarian days, I suppose, if you define teaching as sort of causing someone to know something, I'd say that nothing can be taught because learning happens within the student. It's something that happens inside their head. And obviously then, I kind of mean nothing gets taught. Teaching is just facilitating a student learning. But I mean more than that. I really specifically mean the main knowledge and skills that you as an academic will need to teach your course, I don't think would exist in any pedagogic or teaching book or subject book. And I think that's probably the point where I back up and give some context of where I'm coming from with this. So previously, I still kind of work in the electrical power systems area. I'm a senior lecturer at the University of Manchester. But after my PhD, I went into sort of education and training outside of, mostly outside of universities. So I did facilitation, setting up e-learning platforms and online learning, a lot of sort of train the trainer and in-person facilitation, and then was a software developer in education technology and a consultant for a little while before taking on my current role, which was in the University of Manchester as the academic lead for pedagogy in science and engineering. I also run an MSc program, which is entirely online, which is a bit of fun as well, because that's quite a different format. Faculty of Science and Engineering in Manchester is probably 12,000 students and 800 academics, of which around 100 of those are teaching focused. And I run various projects where I'm trying to improve the way we teach. So I look at promotion criteria, designing training, setting up communities of practice, running conferences much like this one. So I spend quite a lot of time thinking about improving teaching quality. And that's why I kind of wanted to give the context of why I think it's so hard to become an excellent lecturer, is that I think there are certain things you can teach, but the main things you can't. And I do have my hit list. That's sort of the stuff I think all lecturers should know. And here it is. On the left, you've got the knowledge and skills. Hopefully, sort of some of these terms are familiar: constructive alignment, guided activities, sort of fully guided instruction, and direct instruction kind of pieces. And that pulls in, I guess, some of cognitive load theory and multimedia learning theory and those kind of things. But all of that stuff on the left, that stuff that can be taught quite directly. You give me, a group of academics and a workshop, and we can kind of teach that material and then work through how to put it into practice. Slightly harder than that is the attitudes and approach, although I think probably even more important than the knowledge and skills. That kind of idea of, I'm going to bring you along, you, the student, along with me. Let me show you this exciting thing that you'll be able to do. But even there, that stuff that there's been a lot of writing on, there's there's courses, there's books, there's material that exists. All of this is pedagogic knowledge. And that's really just one domain, one area of skill that people need. The two other main ones would be content knowledge and pedagogic content knowledge. So let's just briefly talk about that. So we said the pedagogic knowledge is the stuff I just talked about. Three of my kind of favorite books for those would be How Learning Works, Evidence-Based Training Methods, and Teaching as a Design Science. But I guess the point here is there are books, there are courses where you can just learn this stuff. The content knowledge, for me, a lot of the material I teach to students is in electrical power systems. So books like Kundal's Stability and Control and Granger and Stevenson's Power System Analysis will teach me the subject, although most lecturers, I guess, are hired already having the content knowledge, the ability to do to work in the subject directly. So we've got that third piece, and I just wanted to give a very quick aside that if you start looking at the academic papers on this, a lot of them have moved forwards into TPAC, which brings in technological knowledge, sort of e-learning, kind of virtual learning environments, and other sort of bits of educational technology. That's not as relevant for the discussion I want to have, and I think the technological knowledge should come towards the end of designing anything, so I'm going to skip over it for now. I think the other pieces are more important in general. So if pedagogic knowledge is I can teach in general, and content knowledge is, let's pick a specific example of I can design bridges, I as lecturer. Pedagogic content knowledge would be I can teach bridge design to a specific group of students to a particular level. So I can bring students from one level to another. And that's where the skill really lies. It's not just that if you have pedagogic knowledge and content knowledge, you'll automatically get well, I can now do the combination of them. I think this is a really distinct skill set. And I think that if you get this right, not only does it benefit you in the long term for developing your skill as a lecturer, I think it actually benefits your students directly as you're trying to develop it. But just as an example, I just searched for, okay, can I find a book or a course on teaching bridge design? And if I look online, I did a quick kind of Google search, the first things that come up are all about the content knowledge. It's how to build bridges, not how to teach bridge building. If I look on Amazon, quite interestingly, the first one is on the content knowledge of bridge design. The second one was nothing to do with bridges and was just about teaching generally. And I think this is what you'll find in most places, that combination is rare. I know the Institute of Physics do have a course on teaching physics specifically, and it's great when it exists. But for most of us, we have to build that knowledge itself. So let's go for what is pedagogic content knowledge. Here is my model of what an expert and novice's head looks like, what's going on. So for the expert, the lecturer, we're going to have a pretty well-defined image of our domain, our subject in our head. Whereas for the novice, they might have a relatively well-established base, maybe with some holes in it. They might have chunks where they know what's going on within that, but they don't know how that fits into the wider context. They might have areas where it's starting to form, but certainly not solid, and areas where it's just a mess and there's misconceptions and there's things they don't know. Well, if I, as expert, was to teach this novice, there's no point in telling them stuff they already know, and there's no point in telling them stuff that's entirely disconnected from what they know. There's quite a thin band of things that are useful to teach them. Certainly where this fits, how filling in the gaps on this area and clarifying this mess in this corner. So we need, to be a good lecturer here, far more than developing my own map or developing my own knowledge of how to teach generally, I need an image of what's in the student's head and in going on in multiple students, because I'm obviously going to teach to more than one person at a time. So this brings in things like prior knowledge, specifically misconceptions. If this is an area where most students will make a mistake, that's really valuable for me to know, because I can't just try and paste things over the top. I can't say, here's the correct way of thinking about it. All the research points to, no, you actually have to specifically address misconceptions, show that that's wrong, or design an activity that allows the learner to see that it's wrong before you can move on. That kind of constructivism piece. And so it's not just about what's in the novice's head then, it's about how you take them from where they are to where they need to be. So it's thinking about the analogies or the learning activities or the ways of representing the material that will help the students develop. And that's an entirely separate domain from the subject and from teaching generally. It's very related to what your students come into the classroom with. Understanding that you'll have quite a diverse group of students, and that their needs will be different, and their prior knowledge will be different, and their assumptions will be different. So in general, it's what works when teaching this topic to my students. Now, originally, this came from Lee Schulman, and although the research has developed sort of since the mid-80s when it was originally proposed, actually what was presented in those early papers was pretty close to the idea of pedagogic content knowledge now. What's the most useful form of representation of the ideas within your subject? What makes learning that topic easy or difficult? What are the preconceptions that students have? What strategies are most likely to be fruitful? So that's what it is. And I think I want to spend most of the rest of my 5 minutes that I've got talking about how do we build pedagogic content knowledge as lecturers, and how does that benefit our students? And really, the best way of building it is to sit down one-on-one with a student and listen. Listen as they talk about the subject, listen as they make mistakes, and really approach it with a deep curiosity about, if a student is saying this, what must be going on in their head? What must their state of knowledge look like to produce this answer or this description or this the way that they're describing or presenting the material, or the way they're answering a question. Now, the more opportunity you have to have those one-on-one conversations, the better. But I'm sure, like most of us, your classes will be to quite a large number of students, and it's quite difficult to do this. So you've got to then design activities where learning is visible, because in general, learning happens inside the head of the student. So for me, I'm a big fan of quizzes, although they don't really get into the why. Quizzes will tell you the what. They'll tell you, there's a gap here, or this bit's solid, which is useful, but it gives you a very surface level idea of what's going on. What you really need is to see how students think about it. So peer feedback can be quite useful if you're able to observe that, if you're able to maybe walk around the lecture room, or you're able to see how students comment on each other's work. Getting students to create concept maps and seeing how they literally form their knowledge and how it connects in their own head can be quite useful. But anything where students are handing in work, showing how they think through the material, I think starts to make learning visible. And then once you've had those conversations, once you've seen the output from students, it's approaching it with a curiosity about what must be going on in a student's head to produce that output, and what strategies might work to take them from where they are to where they need to be. And if we do all this, if we kind of design our courses, our learning activities around student interaction, student conversation, a lot of dialogue happening peer to peer, but also kind of from students to lecturers, we end up designing courses in a way that is very student-centered, is very much about guiding the students and listening to individual needs, that should make the courses more inclusive, should make the courses much more sort of reducing the attainment gap, because you're taking students from wherever they are, rather than presenting the subject knowledge clearly, which is I'd say useful but inadequate, to moving towards actually let's really know where my students are, where these group of students are, and just move them towards where they need to be. So what that ends up being is, as the expert, as the lecturer, we need this mental model of what's going on in the student's head. And as the novice, our students, they need to start building a model of how we think about the material and seeing how not just our polished version of us running through a script of solving a particular case study or a particular example or question, but seeing how we really think through things. So they build a model of us. And that's really when learning works best, when we can see the subject through the eyes of a learner and they start to see the subject through the eyes of an expert. That was my 15 minutes. I'm very happy to go into more detail on any of the pieces, but yeah, thank you everyone, and any questions?
Thank you so much, James. And there have been a few questions in the Q&A tab. So first one is from Stephen. I think if you can, do you have access to Q&A tab? If you go in there, you should be able to read the questions. But the question is perhaps more related to andragogy as opposed to pedagogy.
Yes.
How might you facilitate knowledge building amongst the learner cohort in order to allow them to optimize their alterity?
You're going to have to define alterity for me, Stephen. But just on the term pedagogy versus andragogy, I completely agree that the word in its parts is wrong. It's not about teaching children, it's about teaching in general. But yeah, how do you facilitate knowledge building in the learner cohort? I mean, kind of just what I was saying. It's about understanding where the students are, and I'm very much a fan of thinking of specific activities that highlight the misconceptions within the student's own kind of head. So if you can design an activity that shows a student, the knowledge I've got at the moment isn't sufficient, but oh look, there's an activity, or there's a succinct kind of description that helps them move, kind of overcome that knowledge, that gap that they've just seen. That's when I think it kind of works best. To threshold. So Stephen, does that? I'm just seeing there's something in the chat. State of being.
It
other
does,
or different?
thank you.
I don't know.
Good.
I'm
predominantly dealing with postgrads, particularly higher level apprenticeship degrees, and the cohorts come to the program with a huge amount of experience of life and experience in the workplace. And it's a fantastic resource, particularly when you've got multi-organization cohorts, because you've got people from different sectors who approach challenges, opportunities and learning from different angles. And there's an awful lot to be learned from that. So we try and scaffold that process and allow people to build upon the knowledge of the cohort, as well as the program.
Yeah. So I teach a fairly similar sort of international MSc for people who are in industry, and I think there you've got an additional challenge compared to the courses I teach to undergraduate, where there is very different approaches and very different prior knowledge that people are coming in with. But that is also an advantage if you can get students peer learning and to build knowledge off each other, because there's so much knowledge within the cohort, within the sort of the student body, and it will be fresher to them, so that they'll know how to scaffold their own learning or scaffold each other's learning.
It's
if
quite
you can
exciting.
Develop that real community. Yeah.
It's exciting watching people from different sectors, be it public, private or voluntary sector, the different approaches they take to the same problem and how that widens their appreciation of the potential solutions available to them at the end of the
day. Yeah, definitely. Okay,
thank you.
I saw another
Thank
one.
You so much. Now we have from Sally now. Do threshold concepts play some part in PCK?
Yeah. Threshold concepts are sort of one of the core pieces of pedagogic content knowledge. So threshold concepts being that piece of information that once a student obtains it, it opens up so many other kind of possibilities for future learning, makes learning the rest of the subject so much easier, and is a real challenge for a student to overcome. I think having a clear understanding of threshold concepts is probably one of the areas where there's been most kind of to learn from the literature about pedagogic content knowledge for your subject. So if you're looking up threshold concepts within your domain, within your subject, or concept inventories, which are often they're multiple choice questions where every wrong answer is a common misconception. And you can learn quite a lot from them as an academic. They're often quite meticulously designed to have that, lots of students will come in thinking this is correct, and they're designed to highlight students' gaps in student knowledge. So I think trying to think around what are the threshold concepts and then what strategies, and having multiple options for how could we try and overcome or approach those different threshold concepts that might work for different students. That idea of presenting the same information different ways on different days so that they'll pick it up on one of the iterations. While I don't think the research on learning styles holds much weight. I think the research on using multiple representations and multiple ways of presenting information allows a more diverse, allows a wider group of students to kind of overcome thresholds.
Thank you so much. Now we have somebody who's raised hand. Swati, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Right, thanks, Intro. Thanks, James, for the presentation. I was quite looking forward to it, reading the title of your talk. And also quite interesting attitudes column there. So really passionate about what you do. So, I mean, it's more of an observation, perhaps because I teach on professional programs, and, we often invite external speakers and, for a 1 hour session to talk to the students around their experiences or industry experiences. I mean, especially happens when you're teaching corporate programs and, and apprenticeships and, or even, DBA stuff where you have business administrators, who are already professionals. So, I mean, I'm kind of, it's perhaps more of an observation or just to take more your thoughts around it. So do you think that whilst they're giving a talk or whilst the entire session is around their own talk, which is all, which brings a lot of content knowledge from them? So how do you ensure at that situation that the teaching side is kind of, sort of ensured that the students are actually learning? So do you reckon at that point the instructor's role in the classroom is really important, or should they come in between whilst the guest speaker is talking to put in some activities around it? So I'm trying to link together the pedagogic side and the content side, especially when you have an external speaker who could be a professional talking about their experience, but may not have the pedagogic sort of idea.
I know external speakers can be used in a few different ways. So I've seen external speakers used more towards undergraduate teaching, where it's about motivating the students and seeing how the sort of day-to-day teaching that the lecturer does is important to industry, is important to future work. And there, the learning isn't the content really, it's the learning is more about the attitudes and approach of the student to go, no, this stuff really matters, this will get me a job. Whereas I think if you had an industry person coming in, going through a particular case study or example, or talking about how they work through something, that's really valuable if the learner has the scaffolding beforehand to make sense of it. I could certainly imagine you could bring in someone talking about their approach on a particular kind of real case study, real problem they had, and it just not making any sense to the student cohort because they haven't been prepared, because they don't know what to look out for. Equally, you could imagine that depending on the complexity of it, maybe there's something worth doing afterwards with the students where you break down what has been said and relate it back into the course material. So it doesn't feel like, oh, this external speaker does something different than what we learn day to day, that it's really all part of the same thing. So I think scaffolding around that external talk to put it into context, to prepare students for that learning. And then I really wouldn't push an external to introduce pedagogic techniques. I'd allow them to speak in their voice and their way of presenting.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thanks, James.
I don't see any more questions, James. Thank you so much, and it was a very informative talk.